To finish our discussion of gender, we're going to take a look at a theoretical analysis of gender, looking at what folks who subscribe to those different theoretical perspectives in sociology would be concerned about with regards to gender. So, of course, we're going to start with the structural functional approach. And at this point, you are probably aware that the structural functional approach looks at everything in society as being basically functional for society in some way. So the structural functional approach, when it comes to gender, has really been concerned with identifying the functions of gender. So trying to figure out, okay, what are the functions of gender? What does gender do for society as a whole? And these theorists point out that way back in hunting and gathering societies, gender differences were much more important. Back then, men on average, and even today, men on average have been physically stronger than women, and in more primitive societies, the strength of the male was needed out on the hunt in order to take down big game that could provide food for the entire group. Women, on the other hand, couldn't reliably prevent pregnancy, so they had to stay close to home to birth and take care of the children. As societies have evolved with their technology, these gender differences are no longer as important as they used to be. But when it comes to the division of duties, these sex differences have in some ways become institutionalized and are a way of organizing society. Talcott Parsons was one of those early structural functional theorists, and he was concerned with gender and wrote a bit about gender. He suggested that men and women take on complementary roles, that men take on roles that women take on roles that men are not well suited to, and men take on roles that women are not well suited to. In a sense, that makes men and women a bit more dependent on one another. And Parsons suggested that that complementarity has a way of integrating society and linking men and women together into family units. And so as part of that process, gender begins to be important in socialization, with girls being socialized to become more compassionate and nurturing. Those are examples of what we sometimes call expressive traits, which are often associated with females. And boys are socialized to become more active, more rational, and more competitive. Examples of what we sometimes call instrumental traits, which are also more often associated with males, with boys. So those are some of the thoughts of structural functional theorists on gender. And then, of course, we have the symbolic interactionist theorists. And the symbolic interactionists are interested in how we construct our reality through our everyday interactions with one another. And they would argue that gender plays an important role in the process of social construction of reality. That gender is part of our role performance. We talked about that back when we talked about social interaction. So these theorists tend to pay a lot of attention to differences in communication patterns between women and men, and in particular, how those communication patterns help to construct a certain reality. Now, one of the writers who has touched upon this issue and touched upon some of these ideas is a person named Deborah Tannen. She's the author of the book, You Just Don't Understand Me, Women and Men in Conversation. And in her book, what she did is she cited studies that were conducted in an effort to observe patterns in the language of men and women. And so in particular, she was interested in finding out things like who talks the most, who interrupts the most, and do men and women have different conversational styles. And she suggests that men and women do have distinctive communication styles, styles that have different purposes, different rules, and different ways of interpreting communications. she suggests that women use what she calls rapport talk. So rapport or rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, that kind of talk is a way of establishing connections and negotiating relationships. It involves being more concerned with how people feel and with making people feel comfortable. And research suggests that women tend to make a lot more eye contact when in conversation with others, and that they also do more nodding and other nonverbals as a way to sort of encourage the conversation. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to engage in what she calls report talk, so R-E-P-O-R-T, which she says is a way of showing knowledge and skill, but it's also a way of sort of holding center stage and being the center of attention. Now, symbolic interactionists propose that these different patterns are associated with differences in power between men and women. And of course, those differences in power and resources and things like that, that's what the social conflict theorists are especially concerned about when it comes to gender. So moving on to the social conflict analysis, this analysis explains contemporary sex roles in terms of dominance, subordination, and sexism. Social conflict theorists suggest that traditional sex roles have a way of benefiting men at the expense of women who are then oppressed. Now, Karl Marx really didn't focus much on gender, but Friedrich Engels, his friend, collaborator, and benefactor, he really did. He paid a bit more attention to gender than Marx did. And he suggested that capitalism intensifies male domination by making men wealthier and therefore giving them more power, resources, and in turn, greater control over women. Now, another theory related to social conflict theory is what's called intersection theory. And intersection theory involves the idea that factors such as race, class, and gender overlap and interact in society, and as they do so, they may create greater disadvantage for certain people than those people might experience on the basis of just one of those factors by itself. One way to see intersection at work is by looking at what's called Equal Pay Day. In class, we talked about how women earn about 80 cents for every dollar that men do. And one way of looking at this is by looking at how long into the next year women have to work in order to make as much as men did in the previous year. Because women make about 80% of what men do, women are going to have to work on into the next year to make the same amount that men do. But how far into the next year also depends on race and ethnicity. So I have linked to and posted a link in the gender section in Google to this piece, the Equal Pay Day calendar. And it sort of explains what Equal Pay Day is. But then if we scroll on down, we can see for 2021 what the equal pay days have been. So basically what this means is how far into 2021 did women have to work to make the same thing that men made in 2020. So taking into consideration what women made in 2020, but then adding to that into 2021, because it takes that much longer for women to make the same thing. And so down here we have a list of 2021 equal pay days. For Asian American and Pacific Islander women, Equal Pay Day was March 9th, but for all women in general, it was March 24th. But they also divide it according to race, ethnicity, other things like that, but there's a mention of mothers. For mothers, Equal Pay Day on average was around May 5th. And then you can also take a look at the dates for Black women, Native American women, and Latina women. And for Latina women, it's the latest. In 2021, it's October 21st. So to make the same amount that men made in 2020, Latina women would have to work from the beginning of 2020 up through October 21st, 2021 in order to make the same thing. So it's something interesting to take a look at, and as I mentioned, I've posted a link to that in Moodle in the gender section. Now to finish up, we're going to talk a little bit about feminism. And feminism is really an extension of the social conflict analysis. And the way we define feminism is it's the advocacy of social equality for men and women in opposition to patriarchy and sexism. Feminists suggest that the lives and experiences of men and women are different because of their gender, and that quite often the lives and experiences of women are worse than those of men, simply as a matter of their gender. Now, in just a couple of minutes, we'll talk about the different types of feminism, but to begin with, we will take a look at what are called the basic feminist ideas. There are different types of feminism, but there are several ideas that, for the most part, all feminists have in common, or most have in common. But what differs among the different types of feminists is how they feel we should go about achieving the things that they're all in favor of. So, in general, feminists are concerned about these things. First of all, working to increase equality. Secondly, expanding human choice. So making sure that people have choices in terms of careers and things like that that are not just based on gender. Eliminating gender stratification, so some of those differences in pay and things like that that we've been talking about. Ending sexual violence is a fourth goal, and then promoting sexual freedom. So those are the 5 things that, for the most part, feminists are in favor of or working towards. But what makes the different types of feminism different is really how each group feels we should go about accomplishing those things. And so on the slide, you have liberal, socialist, and radical feminism. Those are 3 different types of feminism. Liberal feminism is rooted in classic liberal thinking and the idea that individuals should be free to develop their own talents and pursue their interests regardless of their sex. And liberal feminism emphasizes social and legal reforms designed to create equal opportunities for men and women. Liberal feminists feel that ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment would be a good step toward assuring the equality they seek. Of course, the ERA was passed in 1972, but it wasn't ratified quickly enough. But that's sort of what the liberal feminists believe. But for the most part, liberal feminists believe that we can all kind of do our own thing to try to further the cause. Now, the second type of feminism is socialist feminism. And socialist feminism is based on the ideas of Engels and regards capitalism as increasing patriarchy by concentrating power in the hands of a small number of men. So basically what we talked about just a few minutes ago with that social conflict analysis. So this perspective links women's situations to capitalism, and it suggests that the current family structure results in a form of what they call domestic slavery. And so socialist feminists advocate replacing the traditional family as a way to eliminate gender inequality. So they go a little bit further than the liberal feminists. do. And then finally, we have radical feminism. And radical feminism finds the other forms of feminism inadequate. They believe, or people who are radical feminists, believe that gender equality will be achieved only through the elimination of gender itself. So they believe that we need to get rid of the idea or the concept of gender. And one way they suggest that we can do that is to separate women's bodies from the act of childbearing. And so they might advocate for the use of assisted reproductive technologies as a partial step in that direction. Now, that may seem kind of extreme to a lot of us in many ways, but I think it's related to some of those things that we talked about in class about why there are those differences between men and women in terms of pay, especially that reason related to family and family responsibilities. So those are some of the what the different theoretical perspectives would be concerned about when it comes to gender. One last thing I want to mention is in this section in Moodle, there is a link to this video, Sexism Hurts Men Too. This is a video by a woman named Lacey Green. She does a lot of videos on the internet on sex and gender and other things like that. And so this one is about sexism and the effect it has on both women and men. She has another one. In class the other day, we were talking about dress codes, and she has another one on dress code discrimination. So if you're interested in that one, you might do a Google search for Lacey Green dress code discrimination.